The Senate chamber was already charged when J.D. Vance swaggered in, acting like the room owed him gravity. But all that bravado collapsed the moment he faced Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who sat still, composed, utterly unmoved, as if the chaos belonged to someone else. Vance fired the first insult, loud and dismissive, calling Traoré nothing, a mere soldier from a small nation daring to step into global arenas. Yet Traoré's silence cut deeper than any rebuttal until he finally leaned forward and, with a voice calm enough to rattle steel, asked why a man so sure of himself had hands that couldn't stop shaking, flipping the entire hearing on its head as cameras zoomed in. Senators exchanged stunned glances, and Vance tried to hide the tremor that everyone had already seen. Traoré dismantled him with quiet precision, reminding him that true power doesn't shout, that a man claiming superiority shouldn't fear eye contact, and that those who demand obedience from nations they've never understood reveal more fear than dominance. While Vance stumbled through broken retorts, knocking over his water bottle, his confidence evaporating as the room itself seemed to shift toward Traoré, until finally, grasping for authority, Vance slammed the desk and unleashed a half-finished insult that exposed more prejudice than control, prompting gasps, a whispered he shouldn't have said that, and leaving Traoré smiling, not victorious, not smug, but with the effortless composure of someone who never needed to raise his voice to win. The air in the hearing room tightened as Traoré's smile, slow, lethal, the kind that flipped a room upside down without needing to raise a voice, cut straight through the senator's bluster. And when he finally spoke, he dismantled Vance with a quiet precision that felt more dangerous than anger, reminding him that the villages he mocked raised children with dreams, not cages, and that the nation claiming to guard freedom seemed terrified of anyone who didn't kneel. The silence that followed wrapped around the room like iron as Traoré continued, pointing out that real power isn't inherited through institutions or bought through campaigns. It's earned through truth, something Vance had never learned to face before, leaning closer to ask how a man called nothing could command a global audience while Vance spent fortunes begging for attention, a question that sent murmurs rippling through senators and staffers, who suddenly couldn't look him in the eye. Vance tried to respond, but his voice caught, his confidence collapsing, while the committee chair awkwardly tried to steer the hearing back on track. Yet no one moved, everyone watching the tremor in Vance's hands that betrayed everything Traoré had just exposed. Traoré, perfectly still, reminded him that fear hides quietly in silence, in shaking fingers prompting Vance to hiss that America's patience had limits, only for Traoré to reply that Africa's did too, a line that landed like a fault line cracking beneath the room. As senators exchanged stunned whispers, Vance lunged for dominance again, insisting that America had defeated leaders like Traoré before. But Traoré didn't blink, calmly stating that America kept losing to the very people it underestimated, drawing a faint ripple of laughter from the backbenches as Vance's face tightened in panic. And when he threatened that Traoré was playing with fire, Traoré leaned in with a steady voice forged in battles Vance had never imagined, telling him he was born in fire, a sentence that sent reporters scrambling, fingers flying, as it became clear to everyone present that the senator had entered the room with power, but Traoré was walking out with control. The moment had shifted. What began as a hearing now pulsed like open combat, the kind fought with words instead of weapons. So when Vance tried to claw back authority by mocking Traoré for depending on foreign aid, Traoré stopped him cold with a quiet laugh and a sharper truth, saying Africa didn't need the aid America waved like a benevolent flag. It needed freedom from the chains hidden beneath that very word. And the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Traoré pressed forward with unshakable calm, telling Vance his real fear wasn't a single man, but a world where Africa no longer asked for permission. And the senator's face stiffened as the line hit too cleanly, too deeply. Before Traoré delivered his final strike, if he was truly nothing, then why was Vance's heartbeat louder than his voice, forcing the senator to look away, while cameras zoomed in, capturing the first moment he broke? The chair attempted once more to drag the hearing back to normal procedure, but the room had already abandoned normalcy as every eye locked onto the silent collision between Vance and Traoré, a confrontation that felt larger than two men, gathering what was left of his pride. Vance muttered that clever lines didn't make Traoré powerful, but Traoré calmly countered that real power lived in truth. Truth didn't need applause, didn't need permission, didn't need the Senate's approval to exist. And the blow hit harder than any insult. Scoffing, Vance threw geography at him, calling his country barely on the map. But Traoré's eyes sharpened only for a heartbeat before he replied that nations supposedly small seemed to haunt American nightmares more than the ones it claimed to lead. Drawing gasps and whispers about his fearlessness, Vance leaned in with a low, forced threat, warning him to watch himself. That one wrong misstep could create the wrong enemies. But Traoré raised an eyebrow and answered with surgical precision, saying that if Vance were a real enemy he wouldn't need to whisper, sending the senator recoiling as though struck. And Traoré didn't stop there. He laid out each word like a verdict, explaining that threats belonged to the insecure, that real power didn't shout, real confidence didn't tremble, and real control. He paused, letting the weight of the moment hang between them like a blade. What had once been a formal hearing now felt like a quiet execution, as Traoré delivered his next line soft, steady, terrifyingly direct, telling Vance that a man with real control wouldn't fear a soldier simply sitting across from him. And a cold shiver rippled through the room as even the committee chair sank back in disbelief, while Vance's fist tightened beneath the desk, pride crumbling piece by piece as Traoré continued dismantling him without ever lifting his voice. Scrambling for footing, Vance accused him of destabilizing the world, but Traoré answered with a calm shake of his head, saying he wasn't destabilizing anything, he was stabilizing Africa, and that it was America that feared a confident continent that no longer needed Western loans, lectures, or labels, a truth so sharp it sliced deeper than any insult. And then he delivered the strike that turned the room upside down. He wasn't challenging America, he was challenging the arrogance that blinded it, a line that sent journalists typing furiously and left senators staring in stunned disbelief. As the entire narrative shifted, revealing that Traoré wasn't the one on trial at all, Vance was. The senator tried to salvage authority, but every movement betrayed him. From the stiff way he straightened his tie to the tremor in his fingers that cameras hungrily zoomed in on, while Traoré sat unmoving, solid as stone, his calm presence exposing Vance's unraveling more painfully than any direct attack. Desperate, Vance accused Traoré of encouraging revolutions and chaos, but Traoré simply breathed out, almost amused, explaining that the powerful only call it chaos when those beneath them finally wake up, a line that settled over the room like a revelation even Traoré's critics couldn't deny. Vance leaned in sharply, demanding to know what gave Traoré the right to speak as if he was their equal, insisting he should be grateful just to sit in the room. But Traoré's expression didn't shift. He told Vance he wasn't there as an equal, but as a reminder that the world America built was no longer the world that existed, that its influence was not destiny but something fragile, breakable, already slipping. Vance inhaled too sharply, chest rising faster than he meant to reveal, and Traoré finished the blow by saying the senator was shouting because he was losing the one thing he depended on, fear, and that once people stopped fearing him, his voice became nothing more than noise. Pens scratched frantically, staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks about the inevitable viral fallout, and Vance tried to force a smirk, calling Traoré delusional. But the confidence wasn't there, and Traoré answered with one final, devastating truth: delusion doesn't make senators shake, and the room knew exactly who he meant. The blow landed with surgical accuracy, clean, sharp, impossible for anyone to deny, and Vance's jaw twitched as Traoré leaned back in his chair, settling into a posture that radiated unshakable calm, the kind that made it painfully clear who actually held the ground now. "Senator," he said, voice smooth as steel, "strength isn't measured by volume." A pause settled between them, deliberate and suffocating. "Real strength is staying still when someone tries to break you." Vance didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked trapped inside his own fury while Traoré seemed almost at ease, as though the truth had finally found a room brave enough to hold it. The committee chair made another futile attempt to restore order, but the hearing had already slipped beyond procedure. What sat before the cameras wasn't a senator leading a questioning. It was a man cornered under the weight of his own unraveling. Vance's face had reddened, his shoulders drawn tight, his gaze flicking toward the cameras as if silently pleading for escape. Meanwhile, Traoré remained anchored, disciplined, a soldier sitting with the quiet authority of a man who had endured storms far more dangerous than political hostility. Every sentence he spoke carried the gravity of lived experience, not scripted rhetoric. Vance drew a breath as if preparing for battle and fired back with false bravado. "Let me tell you something, Captain," he said, twisting the title into an insult. "America isn't intimidated by your speeches. We've faced bigger threats." Traoré met his glare without blinking. "Then explain," he replied softly, "why a single sentence from me dominates your national conversation." The room stirred instantly, whispers, shifting chairs, raised brows. Even the chair seemed caught off guard. Traoré went on, his tone unhurried. If I am insignificant, if my continent is insignificant, then why does my presence unsettle you? Why does honesty rattle your confidence? Vance's teeth clenched as he refused to engage. Traoré leaned forward, lowering his voice not out of fear, but to force Vance to actually listen. You claim to defend freedom, he said, yet panic the moment someone refuses to kneel. You call me nothing, but everything about your anger contradicts that. The words dropped into the room with the weight of truth, sending a shockwave through those listening. Desperate to regain footing, Vance tried to accuse him again. You twist everything. You're making this personal. Traoré nodded once. It is personal, he said. Colonialism was personal. Exploitation was personal. Every time Africa asked for dignity and received bombs, sanctions, or lectures, that was personal. Senators shifted, the discomfort unmistakable because nothing in Traoré's voice was exaggerated. It was history speaking. He continued, what you fear is a world where Africa stands tall instead of bowing, a world where nations move without asking for permission. Then he paused, letting the silence settle like dust before delivering the line that would define the entire hearing. Senator Vance, he said, voice low and devastatingly steady, you don't fear me because I'm powerful. You fear me because your power is no longer enough to silence men like me. Vance's expression cracked completely. This time his practiced mask splintering into naked frustration. He no longer resembled the confident senator who walked in, but a man struggling to hold onto authority as it slipped through his fingers. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted so drastically it felt like gravity itself had changed. What had begun as routine political theater had transformed into a global moment, one in which J.D. Vance stood exposed and Ibrahim Traoré dismantled him piece by piece with nothing more than clarity and composure. Vance, cornered, attempted to hide behind a strained smile as he folded his arms defensively. You talk about power like you actually understand it, he said, his voice tight and brittle. Vance tried to recover his footing with a final swing. You talk, he said sharply, as if you understand real influence. True power shapes nations. Traoré nodded slowly, meeting the assertion without blinking. Exactly, he said. Real power does shape nations. He let the pause stretch just long enough for the entire chamber to lean in. And that is precisely why Africa is finally claiming its own future. The words reverberated through the hall like a pulse, steady, certain, impossible to ignore. Even the stenographers faltered for a heartbeat. Vance huffed in frustration. You think raising your voice in a committee room makes you our equal? Traoré responded with a calm that carried more weight than any shout. Equality isn't something you hand out, he said. It's something taken by those who stop waiting for permission. A senator on the far end let out an involuntary breath, impressed despite himself. Traoré pressed forward. You call me nothing, yet one exchange with me has you clenching your jaw, losing your posture, and fighting your own temper. That alone exposes what you refuse to admit. Your world is shifting faster than your grasp. Vance leaned forward aggressively. Be careful, he warned. You're provoking the wrong people. Traoré didn't even blink. No, he said. I'm provoking the right questions. A ripple of murmurs moved like a wave through the audience. Ask yourself, Senator, Traoré continued, his tone tightening with purpose. Why does the idea of an empowered Africa unsettle you? Why does another continent rising make you angry instead of hopeful? What kind of justice demands someone else remain small so that you can remain large? Vance tried to respond, but this time Traoré didn't allow the interruption. You're trembling, he said quietly, not because of me, but because Africa no longer fits into the box you built for it. Whatever composure Vance still had cracked apart under the weight of the statement. His breathing sharpened, the camera zoomed closer, and the panic in his eyes was unmistakable. Traoré lowered his voice, not to soften the blow but to sharpen it. You fear what you cannot command, he said, and for the first time, Senator, Africa is beyond your reach. The silence that followed was so deep it felt almost physical. Not a chair creaked, not a page flipped. Even the photographer slowed, as if afraid to interrupt the moment. Everyone in the room understood they were not witnessing a routine political clash. They were watching a senator lose a battle he thought he'd already won. Vance gripped the desk until his knuckles blanched, forcing out, "You're delusional if you think Africa threatens us. America built the global order. We decide how the world works." Traoré didn't even blink. "Then why?" he asked calmly. "Is the world no longer listening?" A senator coughed. Another shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't an insult, it was an observation, and that made it more devastating. Traoré continued, "You constructed a global order that served you, not humanity. And now you're watching nations walk away from it. That isn't rebellion, Senator. That is evolution." Vance let out a bitter laugh. "Evolution?" he scoffed. "That's what you call it." Vance spat, trying to reclaim authority, his voice sharp. "Countries turning against their allies?" Traoré leaned forward just slightly, a controlled, deliberate motion, and let the word hang. "Allies," he repeated slowly. "Allies don't extract. Allies don't dictate. Allies don't treat resources like trophies or people like statistics." Each word landed like a blade, precise and cutting. The cameras caught a subtle, fleeting tremor in Vance's eyes, an almost imperceptible blink, a small crack in the mask he had worn for so long. Traoré's tone remained level, almost eerily calm. "Africa isn't rising to destroy anyone. It is rising to claim its freedom. But you mistake freedom for hostility because all you have ever known is a world in which you sit above others." Vance shook his head, grasping for footing that wasn't there. "You're twisting this into some moral crusade." Traoré raised an eyebrow, patient, almost amused. "Is morality a twist to you?" Silence descended again, dense and heavy, as if the room itself had shifted to orbit Traoré's words. Everything Vance fired ricocheted off him harmlessly. Nothing landed. "You came here," Traoré said quietly, leaning in just enough to command attention, "expecting me to answer to you, expecting me to fear you. But you cannot intimidate someone who fought for his life long before he ever stepped into this chamber." The line landed like a hammer blow, so precise that even the committee chair leaned back, stunned. Traoré didn't pause. "And you call me nothing?" He gestured not at Vance, but at the cameras, at the audience beyond the walls. "Look at the millions who hear my voice. Look at those who see themselves reflected in the struggle I fight for. Tell me, Senator, is this what nothing looks like to you?" Vance's breathing became jagged, uneven. His facade of control had shattered entirely. Traoré, calm and deliberate, now dominated the room completely, his presence undeniable. Every defensive twitch, every strained breath from Vance only highlighted his unraveling. His shoulders stiffened, throat tightening, each inhalation heavier than the last. The cameras captured it all. Desperate to reclaim authority, Vance jabbed, "You talk like a revolutionary. But revolutions fail. Movements collapse. And when they do, people like you vanish." Traoré didn't flinch, didn't even twitch. "If revolutions failed," he said smoothly, "you wouldn't be terrified of them." The words struck like a sniper's bullet. A journalist whispered, almost breathless, "That's going viral." Traoré leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to underline a fundamental truth. "My people do not disappear. They rise. And they rise precisely because men like you tried to bury them." Vance gripped his pen until his knuckles whitened, eyes narrowing in frustration. "You think you scare us," he barked. "No," Traoré replied, calm as ever. "It's the truth that scares you." The murmur of the room shifted, rippling through every corner. Traoré's voice carried steadily, piercing through the tension. "You hide fear behind volume, behind the illusion of power, behind the notion that the world still bends to your will. But look around, Senator. Look at what is happening while you cling to what you once controlled." Vance's anger crashed through the chamber like a wave, his hand slamming against the table with a sound that rang less like authority and more like desperation. "You are nothing," he shouted, attempting to reclaim some fragment of dominance. Traoré raised a single finger, his calm unbroken, and spoke softly, deliberately. "And still," he said, "your voice is cracking." A collective gasp swept through the room, but Traoré didn't pause. "If I am nothing, Senator," he continued, "why does the world listen to me? Why does your pulse spike when I speak? Why do your supporters glance at you as if you've already lost?" Vance froze, eyes darting around the room, catching every uneasy look, every averted gaze, every camera lens trained not on him but on Traoré. The senator's hands trembled, trying to hide under a stack of papers, but the attempt was clumsy, desperate, futile. Traoré leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to land like steel. "And tell me this," he said. "Why does a so-called nobody make your hands shake like that?" The chamber held its breath. Cameras zoomed in mercilessly, capturing every flicker of panic. Traoré's final words landed like a hammer. "You call me nothing, because the truth terrifies you the day Africa becomes something you can no longer define." Silence descended like a heavy weight. It was no longer a debate. It was the collapse of one man's pride under the quiet force of another's presence. A presence that needed no volume to dominate. The moderator tried to regain control. "Final question. Both of you will address the global audience directly." Lights dimmed slightly, cameras focused, and the room fell into a suspended hush. Vance leaned toward the microphone, forcing what confidence remained, voice brittle. "America is tired," he said. "Tired of chaos. Tired of foreign leaders pretending they matter more than they do. We will not allow outsiders to undermine our values or threaten our interests." The hall remained dead silent. No applause, no acknowledgement. Even his advisors looked away, unwilling to witness the unraveling. Traoré rested both hands on the desk and stood, each motion deliberate, calm, unmistakably powerful. He didn't need to shout. His authority was inherent. "I do not care about your interests," he said, voice low and steady. "I care about the children buried under rubble. I care about generations of Africans robbed of dignity. I care about the world." The cameraman instinctively zoomed closer, capturing the fire in Traoré's eyes as steel hardened into resolve. He pointed lightly at Vance. "Dare to call me nothing," he continued, "but look at yourself. Sweating, hands shaking. Every insult you threw bounced back and hit you instead." His voice dropped lower, colder. "Only a man terrified of losing control trembles this much." Gasps spread through the chamber, and Vance blinked rapidly, caught entirely in the presence of a force he could neither intimidate nor ignore. Vance tried to straighten, forcing himself taller in the chair, but it was a hollow gesture. His shoulders slumped under the weight of Traoré's words, each syllable a hammer striking at the fragile fortress of confidence he had carried in. Traoré didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Yet every line he spoke carried an undeniable authority. "You came here to intimidate me," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, and precise. "Because you believed Africa still bows. It doesn't, not anymore. And you cannot handle that truth. That is why you shake, not because I am nothing, but because deep inside, you are finally seeing what Africa has become." Every word pressed down, and Vance's jaw tightened as the room hung on Traoré's cadence. Then came the line that would explode across the globe within minutes. "The world is changing," Traoré continued, voice steady, eyes unblinking. "And you, Mr. Vance, are not ready for a world where Africa stands upright." Murmurs spread immediately, phones lifted. Advisors exchanged frantic glances. Journalists leaned forward instinctively. Vance opened his mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. His voice, his authority, every ounce of the polished confidence he had carried in, evaporated. Traoré returned to his seat with the same calm that had marked him the entire hearing, unbothered, unchallenged, undeniably in control. Outside, the night had settled over the capital, but the energy was far from calm. Reporters crowded the steps, camera lights flashing like a storm of judgment. When the doors opened and the two men stepped out, the difference was stark. Vance moved hesitantly, jittery, eyes darting toward cameras while his jaw tensed with each step. The weight of the moment etched into every line of his face. Traoré, on the other hand, walked forward like a man who owned time itself, steady, unshaken, commanding the room without a word. A journalist shouted, "Senator Vance, is it true? President Traoré challenged your foreign policy directly." Vance opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Traoré answered instead, his voice calm but cutting through the noise. "When a man calls another nothing, he expects fear. He forgets that fear can reflect back." Vance stiffened instantly. Cameras caught every micro-expression, tightened shoulders, bobbing throat, trembling hands. Another journalist pressed, "President Traoré, what exactly happened behind closed doors?" Traoré's eyes locked on Vance, the entire world seeming to hold its breath with him. I reminded Senator Vance that America's power is not a license to intimidate Africa. When he shouted at me, he proved something far more important. Murmurs erupted around the crowd, and reporters leaned in. What did he prove? Came the inevitable question. Traoré's gaze pierced across the room, calm and unflinching. He proved that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest. Cameras clicked violently, whispers spread, and Vance visibly shrank, searching for his aides, but they were gone, swallowed by the crowd. He was left alone. Traoré descended the steps slowly, and the crowd parted instinctively. No commands, no security presence necessary, just the quiet authority of a man who commanded without force. Reporters abandoned Vance entirely, following Traoré as though drawn by gravity. One shouted a final question at the senator. Senator Vance, are you afraid of President Traoré? He didn't answer. His shaking hand said it all. Within minutes, the clip exploded across social media, a viral storm capturing the man who had attempted to intimidate Africa. Broken by its calmest presence, the world witnessed a moment where courage, clarity, and truth reshaped the balance of power in an instant. Traoré's calm authority and unwavering conviction reminded millions that real strength is not in shouting, intimidation, or fleeting displays of dominance. It is in standing firm when the world expects you to falter. For those paying attention, this is more than a viral clip. It is a lesson in leadership, resilience, and the transformative power of integrity. Whether you are a student of global affairs, an aspiring leader, or someone who refuses to be silenced, study this moment. Reflect, share, and internalize the truth it carries. The quiet, steady voice of conviction will always outlast the loudest claim to power. Follow, engage, and let this lesson shape how you confront challenges, question assumptions, and rise in your own life.